will focus on explanation models of the route to violent extremism by individuals. I have the honor and the pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Rik Coolsaet. Professor Rik Coolsaet is an expert in international relationships and in research on terrorism and radicalisation. The program of our webinar is as follows. So we will start with a short introduction of Bart van Boeghouten, our colleague in the ORPHEUS project and lecturer at the Achtervelde University of Applied Sciences in Ghent, and he will introduce the topic of today and the connection to the ORPHEUS project. Then Professor Coolsaet will give his presentation. We will have a short break afterwards, followed by interaction with all of you. You will have the opportunity to ask questions. The webinar will be closed by Ryan Gorgus, also from the Achtervelde University of Applied Sciences in Ghent. But before we start, there are some house rules. The webinar will be recorded and will be made available. I would like to ask you to mute your microphones and to switch off your camera during the presentations. There are no verbal interventions during the presentations, but you can use the chat function. So if you have any comments or questions during the presentation, please add them to the chat. And when we have a break, the colleagues, Ryan and Bart, will have a look at it together with Rik Coolsaet to see what kind of questions there are in the public and how to address them. And if there are questions of general interest, we will ask the speaker, Rik Coolsaet, to address them directly after the break for everyone. So again, after the break, there is time for questions and discussion. Okay. But before we really start, I want to tell you a bit more about the ORPHEUS project, and just very, very short. It's an international project, and it's funded by the Interreg II CEAS program. It's a collaboration of 8 partners from 4 different countries, and the partners are City of Mechelen and Portsmouth City Council as local governments, Greta Grand Littoral from France and Contour de Twern from the Netherlands, CPI from Belgium, University of Portsmouth from the UK, Achtervelde University of Applied Sciences in Ghent, and the University College Roosevelt in the Netherlands. The main objective of our project is to develop prevention methods focusing mainly on social cohesion and preventing alienation of young people. The ORPHEUS project will provide, among other things, but these are the main ones, safe spaces for vulnerable young people to express their grievances. Second, online safety, and this is very important because we make a link between the online and offline world. So online safety for young people to protect them from online grooming. And last, guidance and policy recommendations for the adoption of an integrated prevention method. A project focusing on such a difficult and controversial, for some controversial topic, is of course met with a lot of challenges. And we identified in the beginning of our project 7 key challenges. And you can see them here. Do we focus on one central safety threat? Which explanation model can we use? What is the role of ideology in extremism? What kind of prevention do we envision? What about online prevention? And what is the role of frontline workers? And last but not least, what is the position of young people? Where can we find young people in all our methods that we're going to develop? Where is their voice? Where is their perspective? Today, in our first webinar, we focused mainly on what kind of prevention we envision. And we presented there the prevention pyramid model we use. Today we're going to focus, I think, more on the second and third question. Which explanation model can we use? And what is the role of ideology? This is not to say that the other questions, the other challenges we are met with are not important. They are all there and will feed the other challenges. Okay, I will now give the floor to Bart van Boeghouten, and he will explain more about the webinar of today and the focus of the lecture of Rik Coolsaet.
Hello, good morning. Good morning to you all, and welcome in the webinar, also from our Artevelde University of Applied Science team. In these webinars, as Hilde explained, we elaborate on some key concepts and models on the prevention of violent extremism. And today we explain on the explanation model, and there is a very good reason to do that, because the majority of the well-known explanation models for radicalization and terrorism describe a process consisting of sequential steps or a staircase or some other linear process. And these linear process models are well known, broadly used in prevention and policies, but they have some problems. For instance, they fail to grasp the unpredictable and diverse paths and timings towards violent extremism. Think of the so-called flash radicalization. Think of the link with petty crime. Think of the question of if ideology is at the start of the process, and so forth and so forth. And therefore, we were looking in literature for alternatives in the start of the project. And we found an extensive summary of recent empirical literature on the causes and dynamics of radicalization by Hafez and Mullins. And they did not find evidence to justify the orderly image of a process. And instead, as an alternative, they suggested a puzzle metaphor based on the combination of 4 elements, so 4 components. Jigsaw puzzle with 4 elements. 1, personal and collective grievances. 2, networks and interpersonal ties. 3, political and religious ideologies. And 4, enabling environments and support structures. And they also stressed the interdependencies between these elements. And I quote, just as similarly structured jigsaw puzzles can reveal different images once their pieces are interconnected, cases of radicalization can exhibit tremendous diversity even when the variables of radicalization are reoccurring. The puzzle metaphor is also useful to highlight the interdependent nature of radicalization variables where one piece of the puzzle contains elements of the adjacent pieces. End of quote. And ORPHEUS uses this puzzle model instead of the mainstream linear models to tackle the interplay of risk factors by strengthening positive networks, by offering legitimate channels for the public expression of grievances, by promoting inclusive alternatives on society. And in this webinar, we want to reflect on this puzzle model and on the explanation models for violent extremism by comparing it with an actual explanation model developed by Professor Emeritus Rik Coolsaet. In a forthcoming publication, which is a chapter in an edited volume by Diego Muro and Tim Wilson's Contemporary Terrorism Studies, Professor Coolsaet develops an explanation scheme based on the long historic path of terrorism studies since the 1960s. And just as Martha Crenshaw, the founding mother of terror studies, you could say, 3 decades earlier, Professor Coolsaet reiterates the integration of the individual micro level into an overall approach, including the meso level of the group dynamics, as well as the macro level of the societal context or contexts in plural. In this webinar, Professor Coolsaet will explain his model and apply it to both jihadi and far-right terrorism. We are very glad that we can welcome Professor Coolsaet. He is Professor Emeritus of International Relations at Ghent University, Belgium, and Senior Associate Fellow at the Egmont Institute for International Affairs in Brussels. He was a member of the original European Commission expert group on violent radicalization established in 2006 and the subsequent European network of experts on radicalization. He has been coordinating research on terrorism since 9/11, and this has resulted in a number of books, essays and articles. His Jihadi Terrorism and the Radicalization Challenge European and American Experiences was published by Ashgate in 2011, and 4 successive studies on radicalization and the ISIS generation were all released by the Egmont Institute. His contribution, Radicalization, the Origins and Limits of a Contested Concept, was included in an edited volume in 2019. This book, very interesting book, by Nadia Fadil, Martin de Koning and Francesco Ragazzi on radicalization in Belgium and the Netherlands, critical perspectives on violence and security. So we thought if one person is well placed to guide us through the history of the explanation of violent extremism and terror and helping us finding the consensus and the dissensus within the world of scholars, it will be Professor Coolsaet. After the presentation, there will be a short break. Feel free to post questions and remarks during the presentation. We will discuss them in the second part of the webinar. Professor Coolsaet, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bert. Thank you, Hilde, for having me, for giving me the opportunity to share a couple of ideas with this accumulated wisdom I see in the list of participants. Let me put the record straight from the beginning. I do not claim any originality in what is going to follow in the next, I don't know, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, we'll see. When I say I don't claim any originality, because basically what I experienced when viewing the literature on terrorism and on radicalization, with a bird's eye, with a bird's view, correcting back a little bit, starting already at the end of the 19th century. Well, we invented the concept and the word of radicalization after 9/11, especially after 2004 and 2005, the attacks in Madrid and in London, for addressing the very same questions that have been raised also before, starting in the 19th century. What is the origin of terrorism? What are the root causes of terrorism? Why do individuals embrace political violence? Why do they join terrorist groups? What are the root causes that can explain the emergence of terrorism? These questions have been raised each and every time that societies were confronted with a significant wave of terrorism, and this already started, as I said, at the end of the 19th century. And being a little bit provocative, well, all of us, we have been working in different capacities on radicalization and de-radicalization and disengagement. But this new concept of radicalization that we invented basically in Europe after 2004 has this enabled us of better answering the old questions than the former answers that we got from the 19th century. And I would say, again, a bit provocative, in a certain sense, obviously, yes, but also perhaps not as well as we could hope for in 2004. In a sense, radicalization as a concept has been less helpful than we imagined in 2004 when discussing within the agencies and the European institutions what is radicalization. It has been less helpful than we thought right in the beginning. And to take the long view, if we start in the 19th century, so at the end of the 19th century, in the last quarter of the 19th century, the world, and when I say the world, large parts of the world, Europe, Russia, the United States, we were confronted with a significant and the first significant wave of contemporary terrorism, which at that time was anarchist terrorism. This did not lead to an extensive body of research and literature, but what is interesting to view the discussions at that time, at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the early 20th century, it is the variety of competing paradigms, points of view on how to explain in a world that was getting richer, more globalized at the end of the 19th century, how can you explain that all of a sudden you had this emergence of violence, of political violence, which was unexpected and for the well-offs at that time were very difficult to explain if you saw the richness and the evolution, the rapid technological and international evolutions at that time, which seemed to be very positive. And you had, as competing paradigms, people who were saying, well, those terrorists, those anarchists, they are insane. The whole discussion that we are still having today about the importance of mental illness. You had a second point of view that said, a second paradigm that said, you know, what we are confronted as a civilized society, we are not confronted with insane people, but with an international conspiracy which wants to bring down civilization. A third paradigm at that time was completely the contrary of the second one. You know, in terrorism, even if it's hard to grasp, terrorism basically springs from the many injustices in society. What I'm now quoting as different paradigms are quotes from the 19th century. But in a certain sense, if you look at the discussions on radicalization nowadays, the paradigms are not that different nowadays compared to the 19th century. Well, anyway, as I said, there was no substantive body of research. What I was quoting was press clippings, was political statements, but there was not really an extensive research as we would witness in a second wave of contemporary terrorism. It was a radical left terrorist wave that started at the end of the 1960s, and which lasted, let's say, till the mid 80s. So some 20 decades of extreme left, radical left terrorism with different shapes, different varieties. But basically, if you would put it in one word or in one concept, in one way or another, they expressed radical left ideas. And the background was the simultaneous rise of national liberation movements, especially think about Palestine. It was the urban guerrilla in Latin America. It was the Basque and the Irish Republican turn to violence. And it was also the violent left-wing terrorism groups in Germany, in France, in Italy, also a little bit in Holland and in Belgium. And as we are now witnessing today with our discussions on radicalization, you had a wide variety of discussions, a wide variety of paradigms, a wide variety of conclusions in the extensive body of the 70s and the 80s on the study of terrorism. In a sense, the study of terrorism, the founding date lies in the 70s and the 80s, and notwithstanding all the differences and all the heavy academic and political discussions, you could say that by the mid-80s there was a kind of broad but real consensus on a number of key drivers of terrorism. And looking back at that literature, I would say there were 4 elements which, with different emphases, nevertheless represented a kind of a consensus among academics. The first one being, that sounds easy now, it is complex. Terrorism is a complex interplay between societal context, psychological considerations, group dynamics. It is a complex interplay that defy easy answers. That I think most of the academics and the scholars at that time would agree with. A second kind of consensus was that context is the essence in the study of terrorism. Terrorism does not happen in a political or social void. You have to integrate the emergence of terrorism with the societal characteristics at a given moment. Otherwise, you cannot explain why at a given moment you have terrorism and at other moment you don't have a terrorist campaign. But at the same time, and I think, Bart, you mentioned Martha Crenshaw, which was the founding mother of terrorism studies in the United States, she said, do not consider terrorism to be an automatic outcome or an automatic reaction to a given context. So something more is needed, and something more, it is the psychological considerations and especially the group dynamics. So context is of the essence. That would be the second consensus. Third consensus by the mid-80s among the scholars of terrorism is personal characteristics. They are important. They do play an important role, but we don't know how. So people would say, for instance, Martha Crenshaw would say, it is complicated to explain the emergence of terrorism, but it's even harder to explain and comprehend the embrace by individuals of political violence. Why do certain individuals do, and why others don't, even with the same background? What was, however, clear with the personal characteristics, there is no single profile. So you cannot explain terrorism by a kind of a unique personal characteristics that is shared by all terrorism. It is, and that's a second point with these personal characteristics. It is not about the poor. It is not the poor, the most destitute, who embrace political violence. To say a little bit again provocative, terrorism most of the time is a middle-class phenomenon. It is not a phenomenon put forward by and carried out by the most destitute. And sorry, if there is no single profile, no unique profile, there are many motivations. There can be ideological, there can be group dynamics, there can be revenge, there can be family situations that explain why an individual joins a terrorist group or become a terrorist. So many, what we now would call trajectories into terrorism, was already at that time identified as let's say a kind of a consensus among the scholars. And the fourth and the last point of consensus by the mid-80s in the study of terrorism is ideology, and Hilde spoke about it in her introduction. Ideology is important, but less so than the general public or the policymakers imagine. And I'm quoting the research by the mid-80s. Do not consider ideology as the fixed set of axiomas. Ideology should be considered in this framework in the study of terrorism, should be considered as a kind of a set of lenses through which you look at a society, you look at an environment, you look at society that explains what is going wrong in society, and that offers a kind of a guide for behavior, for addressing wrongs in society. So ideology not as a fixed set of beliefs, but as a belief system or a set of lenses. So I would say, looking at the literature in the 70s and the 80s by the the experts of that time, Martha Crenshaw, Paul Wilkinson, you had the impression that there was the beginning of an academic, a scholarly field of research. But then what happened in the mid-80s? In fact, the study of terrorism declined, just as terrorism itself declined. So you had a decline in terrorist attacks almost everywhere in the world, and the interest of addressing the old questions evaporated. So some scholars continued, but the frenzy research for answers on the old questions disappeared till 9/11. And 9/11, again, like in the 70s, against the background now of jihadi terrorism, the emergence of jihadi terrorism, again, you saw this sense of urgency renewed in the search for answers for the old questions. But and the same applies also to me, what we did not realize enough when we started to look into the old questions was that some answers had been provided in the 70s and the 80s. So most of the research in the beginning of the post 9/11 era did not take into account or did not pay much attention to the earlier answers. And some of you will be familiar with the discussion after 9/11. Are we now in the presence of a new kind of terrorism? And if it's a new kind of terrorism, then the old answers are not important. But are we confronted with another form of the old terrorism? And then we should look again into the old questions. But the second stance was a minority stance. It was attacked by people like Martha Crenshaw, who said, "No, look, there's less new than meets the eye in the terrorism of today." But most, I'm afraid to say, most of the scholars, but also amongst the policymakers, considered that we were confronted with a whole new phenomenon, never happened before. So why would we look into the past in search for answers to these questions? And so after 9/11, especially as I said, after 2004, we invented and we coined new concepts like radicalisation, like violent extremism, countering violent extremism, preventing violent extremism. But if you try to take stock of the radicalisation research, and if you compare it with terrorism research of the 60s, 70s, and the mid-80s, did we learn something new, or were we simply repeating the old questions? And I would say, in a certain sense, radicalisation studies and the practitioners, also the practitioners amongst you who have been working in the field on de-radicalization and disengagement, I would say we came unwittingly to the same conclusions as by the mid-80s, without realizing it. The same conclusions, but also we deepened our understanding in some of the unanswered questions, like, for instance, the importance of group dynamics. But in some aspects, radicalization studies experienced a step backwards compared to the terrorism studies of the 80s, by the mid-80s. And I would say, again, taking a bird's view on the results of the research and the practice in de-radicalization disengagement, can we again speak of a kind of a broad consensus? We are all familiar with the difficult discussions amongst ourselves about, again, Hilda, referring to what you said, the importance of ideology. There are heavy discussions going on, like there were heavy discussions going on in the 70s and in the 80s. Are we clear about root causes? Some would say Salafism is a root cause. Otherwise, others would say, no, it is in the context that you have to find the root causes, etc., etc. But notwithstanding the discussions, again, like by the mid-80s, and please correct me if I have it wrong, but I still have the impression, to the surprise of some, that we reached again on certain key drivers, certain key elements of radicalisation / terrorism, a kind of a broad but real consensus. The first one would be, and there again, that's nothing new what I'm now going to say, it is exactly a repetition of what was said by the mid-80s in terrorism studies. Radicalisation and terrorism is the result of an interaction between personal trajectories, group dynamics, and context. And what Bert was referring to, the puzzle model of Havès and Mullins is a good example of this multi-dimensional or multi-factor dynamics of terrorism and radicalization. But in fact, if we are saying this, we are not saying anything more or more original than what we already knew by the mid-80s. Second point, I think of broad consensus, that is that the context is important, and there is now a solid research-based evidence that group feelings of injustice is the major root cause. It's not the only one, but group-based feelings of injustice is the major root cause that explains why at a certain moment you have this emergence of a terrorist wave, and at a certain other moments in human history you don't have it. But the difficulty when stating this is it's always difficult to relate individual behavior to such a kind of a broad context. Some of you will be familiar with Ted Gurr, his study in the 70s about dissatisfaction and relative deprivation, but it's very hard, either scholarly or when you are as a practitioner in the field, you are confronted with a jihadi or right-wing terrorism, to relate this to this overall context of feelings of injustice. And because it is so difficult to exactly relate both individual behavior and context, there has been, like in the 70s and the 80s, there has been a kind of a preference to the micro level individual behavior as the main focus of radicalization research and de-radicalization and disengagement efforts. So in fact, emphasizing the individual behavior to the detriment of the contextual factor is a kind of a step backwards compared to the consensus of the 80s, that you have to take into account the context. Otherwise, you cannot explain why at a given moment so many individuals embrace a form of political violence. Third point of, I think, broad consensus is that group dynamics is crucial. You find it in most of the early models and also in the later models on radicalization. Most often, even if we speak about lone wolves, most often you as an individual, you do not embrace political violence, you do not become a terrorist only by yourself. It's not only an individual process, it is a process which is being boosted, which is being pushed forward, which is being influenced by social bonds. Like Mark Sagemond in 2008, I think it was 2008, for the first time said, it's about a bunch of guys. Well, I would say a bunch of guys and girls, to be clear. It is in this field, group dynamics, that radicalization studies compared to the old terrorism studies have proven to be the most innovative. And I would say, for me, the best description, the short description of radicalisation is one offered a couple of years ago by Alex Schmidt. He said radicalisation is a socialization and mobilization process. I will come back to this. Radicalisation, according to Alex Schmidt has been for 20 years the head of the Vienna-based United Nations Counterterrorism Agency. He has also been a member of the original expert group of the European Commission that was set up in 2008 to explain to the Commission and to the member states what radicalisation basically was. But we can come back to this. So this remains for me the best, in a nutshell, radicalisation, view it as a socialization and mobilization process. Fourth point of broad consensus, again, similarly to the 80s, to the consensus of the mid-80s, of course you have to take into account personal characteristics. And this dimension, just as the group dynamics, is now better documented based on the extensive research and the extensive first-hand research that has been produced since 9/11. We do know, evidence-based, that mental illness is not a defining factor. Well, you can say it is the same as was opined already in the 80s, yes, but now it is much more evidence-based than it was then. There is no single profile. Again, it's a repetition of what was already thought in the 80s, but now again, evidence-based. You can see many trajectories into terrorism, into joining terrorist groups, into the foreign fighters issue. There seems also to be, a bit like Martha Crenshaw said, it's not because mental illness is not a defining factor, that personal characteristics do not play a role. They do play a role. It defines the role that you're playing into in a group. It's defining how you will act. It is determining what motivates you. And for instance, I think amongst those of us who have been studying the foreign fighters issue basically linked with the Islamic State mobilization, that is that there seems to be personal characteristics that play a role into joining the Islamic State. We do not know exactly how and why, but mental disorders seem to play a role, but we don't know exactly how to relate and how important they were compared to other factors of mobilization. And also in these personal characteristics, there is strong evidence that perpetrating a terrorist act in your own country happens less than perpetrating terrorist acts against foreigners outside of your own country. Again, there is nothing new compared to the 80s, but we know, evidence-based, we know that, for instance, from the returnees from the Islamic State, the level of de-radicalization / disengagement is much higher than we feared at the start of the issue of the foreign fighters' departures. Last and fifth area of consensus, ideology. Ideology, again, is important, but there is no exact automatic relationship between having extremist ideas and putting them in practice. So there is a kind of a weak relationship between ideas and action. And then the question is, how important is it? It plays a role, but what role does it play? And now I come to the presentation, to the model I would suggest to you. Let me see if I can shift the screens. Just a sec. Okay.
Yes,
What
yes.
I'm proposing you is this scheme. And again, as I said in the beginning, I do not claim any originality. Everything what's in the what is in this model, in this scheme, has been said before, has been studied before. Somebody else has said it before. What I try to do is to put it all together as a kind of the expression of the state of play in terrorism / radicalisation studies nowadays. And Bart has been speaking about the model that ORPHEUS borrowed from Hafez and Mullins. I will show you the model proposed by Hafez and Mullins. What is the difference? Networks is the same as what I would propose mobilization hubs. Ideologies by the Hafez and Mullins model is the same as the ideology which is down the down circle in the model. The enabling environment of Hafez and Mullins, it is the conducive environment you see at the apex of the model. But then the grievances. The main difference between the Hafez-Mullins kind of puzzle and the state of play, the state of art in the model that I present, is the circle to the right, the opportunity, the offer. And I will show you two persons. Some of you will be familiar. I think the Belgians amongst the participants will be familiar with the two persons. The first one, this is a guy. His name is Pierre Garrett. He was the leader of the CCC, which was the Cellule Communiste Combattante, I would say the last remainder of the radical left wave, terrorist wave of the 80s. He was arrested in 85. He was released in 2008. And you see Pierre Garrett here when he leaves prison. Clearly, whatever, if there have been any attempts and endeavors to de-radicalize him in prison, clearly they were not very successful, because the first thing that he did before the journalists and the photographers, when he left the prison, he raised his fist and he declared his fight against capitalism as necessary and as needed as 20 years earlier. And then a second person to the left, Jean-Louis Denis. Jean-Louis Denis was a jihadi recruiter. He worked in Brussels. He was convicted in 2013, well, arrested in 2013 for having sent a number of youngsters to Syria. He was arrested, he was convicted in 2018. He came out of prison, he left prison, and almost the same image as with Pierre Garrett to the right. It was not a fist that he raised, but a 20 euro bill. And he said, some people are giving their life for 20 euro. I will give my life always to Allah. So again, like with Pierre Garrett, clearly he was not de-radicalized in prison. So you have two episodes, two different waves of terrorism, the radical left to the right, well, a bit strange to say so, to the right of your screen, and the jihadi to the left of your screen. You have two important and influential leaders. What is the difference between the two? The difference between the two, I think, is being explained by this model I do present. Pierre Garrett, when he came out in 2008, he could give the same message. He could use the same narrative as he did 20 years earlier. But unfortunately for him, fortunately for society, but unfortunately for this revolutionary, nobody was listening. There was no longer an environment that pushed individuals to listen to what Pierre Garrett was saying. And it is completely different with Denis. I'm afraid that the jihadi narrative or ideology is still is still vivid today. There is still a kind of a conducive environment, but there is no opportunity. Sorry, that's a little bit too early. So coming back to the scheme, the conducive environment, in French, we would use the word terreau. In Dutch, we would use the word voedingsbodem. But the conducive environment is a word that was used already in the 80s. You can also use the word the push factors or preconditions. It is that environment that allows at a certain moment in history for the emergence of a significant group of individuals to embrace political violence. The second element would be an opportunity, an offer. An alternative word for opportunity or an offer would be a pull factor. So you have the push factor, which is a conducive environment. You have the pull factor that draws people, that draws individuals to a certain cause, to a certain opportunity that triggers, and I will come back to the word trigger, that triggers individuals to embrace a certain kind, depending on the era, a certain kind of political violence. Under the circle underneath ideology. Ideology, again, like it was said by the mid-80s, it is not about a fixed set of axiomas. I think we have paid too much attention and we have spent too much energy in trying to explain the difference or the similarities between Salafism and jihadism. Ideology, as I use it, again based upon the studies on terrorism by the mid-80s and the individual cases of radicalisation that we are now witnessing. Ideology is a narrative, the narrative that inspires. It's not about doctrinal fine print. It's about the credibility of the message. Ideology, well, if you take ideology as a set of axiomas, for instance, Salafism or Marxism, an ideology understood this way is sterile, does not mobilize if there is no conducive environment, if there is no opportunity. So you can read now the same texts as the revolutionaries in the 60s, 70s and the 80s, but you will not become a radical left terrorism because there's something missing, and this something is the conducive environment for the kind of message that in the 60s, 70s and 80s was mobilizing, and the kind of opportunity at that time that was offered and which is now absent. So ideology, it only works if there is an environment that allows it to mobilize. And then to the left-hand side, the mobilization hubs, well, that's nothing new. It is the kind of bunch of guys that Mark Sageman was speaking about. It is the kind of lone wolves, even lone wolves, who are not part of an organized hub. They are considering themselves member of a virtual community. So you happen to get into the business of terrorism through a group or through a community. Let's now be a little more detailed. Here you have the four circles: the conducive environment, you have the opportunity, the ideology, mobilization hubs. What would be the conducive environment? That explains the emergence of jihadi terrorism, but at the same time also allows for an explanation of the radical left terrorism of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and of the anarchist terrorism of the end of the 19th century. These would be the three elements, sorry. As I said earlier, evidence-based, the feeling of injustice, do not misunderstand me. It is not necessarily that each and every individual is the victim of injustice. It is that there is a group which you are part of, or with which you consider yourself in solidarity. There is a group that experiences a sense of inequality, injustice. This group feels that it is being threatened in its very existence, or you might say in its very identity. And this is surrounded by an atmosphere, by a kind of zeitgeist of polarization, the us versus them. This conducive environment, in every period in history that you can imagine, led to radicalization. But radicalization in the generic sense of the word, radicalization in the as we started to use it after in our first discussions between 2008 and 2004, radicalization as being, well, more radical than mainstream. Radicalization meaning that you oppose and that you try to correct this situation of injustice, this threat to a group. Radicalization is that you take action, whatever action, from it can be violent, it can be non-violent, it can be group-based, it can be individual, it can be trade unions, it can be political parties, but it can also be a terrorist group, that you try to correct, that you try to redress the situation of injustice. We are not speaking about terrorism at this stage, but this, for me, seems to be a crucial element. As was said by the mid-80s, it is the essence on which terrorism can emerge. This situation, this conducive environment, can lead to competing offers, as I said. Competing offers, violent or non-violent action, trade unions, political parties, social action, different kinds of action to address the injustice in the conducive environment. And one of the offers, one of the opportunities might be a terrorist group. If a terrorist group succeeds in explaining how what I propose is embracing violence as a way of addressing the injustice in the system, that we are riding the tailwind of history, that the history is behind us, that you can explain how the effort, the individual effort that we are going to do, joining in a terrorist group, perpetrating an attack, that this is really what history is pushing us to do, and it will make us agents of history. If a terrorist group is able to offer this this opportunity, this credible opportunity, it can declare itself, just as Al-Qaeda has done, as ISIS has done, a kind of a self-proclaimed vanguard of this group which feels the injustice and which is being existentially threatened. But of course, if you are a group of 10, 20 or 100 or a couple of hundreds, you need a couple of thousand more in order for you to make a difference. That's the role of ideology. An ideology or a narrative, again, as was said in the 80s, it frames the environment, the conducive environment. It explains the dissatisfaction, and it explains why violence is the sole adequate response to the conducive environment that is full of injustice. So this basically, and mobilization helps, that's clear. You do not become a terrorist only by yourself. You do it most of the time through social interaction with others, with peers, with groups. This, I would say, helps us to explain what terrorism is about. What explains the emergence of terrorism? Does it explain individuals joining a terrorist group? No, but it explains in what environment significant groups of individuals would take the same path of embracing terrorism. Now, at this point, Bart, I'm not quite clear how much time I still have.
Yeah, but you can go on if you want.
Okay, let's again take this this frame and try to apply it, but I will be very short in this. Try to apply it to jihadism and apply it to the far right wave that everybody is now warning about. The conducive environment for the emergence of jihadi terrorism, of jihadism in the 90s, was at the same time the American triumphalism at the end of the Cold War. We won, and the zeitgeist, the common feeling of the time of the clash of civilization, and in Muslim circles and in Muslim countries, the feeling that the West, and in particular the United States, had declared war on Islam. This was the 90s. This conducive environment, but at the same time, in the 90s, you had a diverse set of local situations of injustice, of conflict, of marginalization, where Muslims were always implicated. You had the occupation in Palestine, you had the social and the political malaise in the Arab world, you had different kinds of rebellion, civil war and separatism in Afghanistan, in Chechnya, in South Thailand. You had the structural discrimination of second and third generation migrant youngsters in Europe, feeling themselves rather as second-class citizens. So this would be the conducive environment. Did we knew this in 2001? No, we didn't realize it, that this was a kind of conducive environment that pushed forward jihadi terrorism. I do remember discussions right after 9/11 between European officials and American officials about root causes. We Europeans, we always said to our American colleagues, there has to be something that explains why 9/11 happened. The Americans at that time, it took Obama to use the same words as the Europeans. The Americans at the time refused to speak about root cause. Root cause was a taboo word in the United States at that time. But we were always insisting, and the Americans were fed up with us at a certain point about root causes, but we hadn't a clue. To be honest, we didn't know exactly what the root causes, and now we would say the conducive environment exactly was. Then we come to the opportunity. What was the opportunity? The opportunity, or I would say in this period, a number of triggering effects. Afghanistan in 2001, Iraq in 2003. It was as if the war on Islam that many Muslims suspected in the 90s came true. The Americans invading Iraq was clearly, for many Muslims, the proof that indeed the West has embarked upon a war on Islam. And you had then a number of mobilizing symbols that gave the impression that the era of Islam was near. You had the defeat of the Shah of Persia by the Iranian Revolution in 79. You had the defeat of the Red Army in Afghanistan in 87. You had Somalia in 93. For those who have seen Black Hawk Down, how the American helicopter was shot down by in the sky, in the Somalian sky. Well, this was taken as proof that Muslim militants can take down Americans. And then, of course, you had 9/11 in 2001, which was WTC, the symbol of the American empire that was taken down. And Al-Qaeda at that moment took it upon itself, and this was really the effort of Osama bin Laden, to proclaim itself as a revolutionary vanguard. Follow me, and we will lead you into a new era of triumphant Islam. And even more so, with the Caliphate reborn by ISIS. So the ideology, the narrative, seems to be quite credible at that time, that jihadism had indeed the history behind it, while pushing jihadism. Jihadism was offering kind of a common perspective of revolt against the powers that be it the West or being the apostate regimes in the Muslim world. Jihadism spoke to the disenfranchised and the marginalized at that time as no other ideology could possibly do at that time. So this would explain for me why at the after 9/11 you had those successive waves of mobilization, jihadi mobilization after Afghanistan, Iraq, and then especially in Syria and Iraq. Turning now to the far right wave, to the radical wing extremism. What would be the conducive environment? The conducive environment would be the social malaise that all societies are feeling now as a result of a series of developments since the 80s, the end of the Cold War, rapid technological evolutions, migration everywhere. And so opinion surveys show that in most of the countries, for the last 10, 15 years, the majority expresses the feeling that the world is getting worse and not it's getting better. A couple of exceptions like China, but there is a social malaise that gives the impressions to large parts of all societies of being left behind. And again, there is this growing inequality, especially in the last 10 years, the growing inequality and feelings of injustice. And this environment is very, is boosting the search, like always in history, for scapegoats. And it also gives the impression of an existential threat to all those who are feeling left behind. It is the fear of migration, well, now speaking about Europe and speaking about the United States, the feeling of migration is changing our societies. Multiculturalism is changing the characteristics of the old Western, American or European culture. Muslims are being and Islam, the major religion in the world that are giving us the feeling of being superseded in what we were. And the social polarization around identitarian themes, the culture wars, to use an easy word, that is a kind of the zeitgeist of today. In this conducive environment, what's the opportunity? What is the triggering effect? Well, what happened in the United States, if you look back now, in 2009, the first Afro-American president came into the White House, and you saw the rise of right-wing activism, militants, and in the Republican Party, the Tea Party, increasing in importance, increasing its influence and its significance. In the European Union, unfortunately for the Europeans, you had this success of right-wing political parties in the last decade. In all of our parliaments, in the European Parliament, there are now much more of a presence than there were 20 years ago. And you had in Europe 2015 and 2016 the asylum crisis, the jihadi attacks in Brussels, in Paris, and other places in Europe. This is the opportunity. This is the triggers of the opportunity that gave the opportunity to groups that embraced a narrative which we all know nowadays, which is called the Great Replacement, the Islamization of the West, which is anti-migration, anti-elite. These elements, which are quite present, unfortunately again, in our zeitgeist, in our societies, in the public, but also in the political discourse, is now formulated as a narrative by new right-wing groups. And those new right-wing groups, they are the mobilization hubs that nowadays make intelligence services and police services fear that we are witnessing the emergence of a right-wing extremist wave, which might become a terrorist wave. And quoting a couple of qualifications from intelligence services in the West, they are speaking of important fluid groups who have growing confidence. There is a trend to arm itself. They're internationally linking amongst themselves. So there is now this emergence of the kind of international and internationalized mobilization amongst a right-wing group that 20 years ago we saw emerging in jihadi circles. And sorry, I have been much too long